that she would go, and she was there, as you say, among them. She was also in Mar-a-Lago a couple of weeks ago visiting Donald Trump, setting out the agenda for the next couple of months, whereas Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was lying in bed then with pneumonia, but did have a phone call before Giorgia Meloni went to President Meloni.
Yeah, and I think that then begs the question, well, how will that play out for the years to come? Will indeed Trump sort of divide and conquer, which I think is very much a likelihood, because with his transactional approaches, he will probably pick and choose the causes that he is going to focus on, the priorities he's going to focus on, but also see with whom he can have the best deal. So there were already analyses the past couple of weeks, like who is going to be the Trump whisperer in the EU. Some say also due to the fact that Giorgia Meloni and Elon Musk seem to be quite close, that perhaps Meloni is the one that passes best messages to Trump. I think, however, the risk is then that it's not so much about European interest in the US, but it's mainly going to be about US interest in the EU. Because if you look at Italy, the fact that now indeed with Starlink and big telecommunications deal that Musk probably is going to make with Giorgia Meloni, that's not so much about EU interest per se, but about US interest in Europe. And I think that is very important and also quite telling potentially.
And we saw today, Stefan, AmCham, that's the American industry or American companies lobbyist today, putting out a statement saying that American companies in Europe, that 9 in 10 anticipate a worsened EU-US trade and investment relationship. Are we set up here now for a couple of very rocky years?
Well, certainly we're in for years, for unpredictable years, I would say. I mean, we just heard Trump's speech, and I want to say that nothing that he said was a surprise. He was basically rehashing his campaign statement. So whatever happens next, it's anybody's guess. I would say though the following: the European Union is the biggest market in the world. It's a top market for U.S. companies, and it's no wonder that corporate America is now worried that things might go south. The U.S. and the European economies are deeply entwined. So whenever you try to hit the European economy, you will definitely hit parts of the U.S. economy as well, and American workers, American families, etc. So what I'm saying is I'm not sure whether everything that Trump said during the campaign regarding tariffs and punishing economies, European countries, with the possible exception of Germany, of course, will come to pass or not. This is we're in not uncharted territory here, but Trump says something today and tomorrow something different, and I think this is his style that we have to get used to again, that we learn about policy developments on social media in the morning when we wake up. Anything can happen.
Anything can happen.
At the same time, yes, he's unpredictable, but he's also somehow predictable in the topics, the priorities that he has been focusing on throughout the years, because it's about tariffs, which he has called the most beautiful word in the dictionary, I believe. It's very much about defense and security in NATO. And even though indeed we know he's unpredictable and he will be very much into deal making and very let's say hard, he's transactional, but also hard trade-offs that the EU is not used to as such. Because think about J.D. Vance saying, well, if you're going to attack our big tech sector, we're going to perhaps leave NATO. And again, that sort of trade-offs, which are irrational trade-offs and don't stem from a multilateral perspective, that the EU is not used to. But I think there's elements of predictability and deal-making that he is sort of renowned for and that we will see much more often.
And just on NATO, we've seen Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, already take to X to express his congratulations to President Trump, saying that now it's time to turbocharge defence spending. We also saw the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Antonio Costa also take to X to express their congratulations. Ursula von der Leyen, of course, as we speak, jetting off to Davos to join the global elite. And also she wants to give a speech there and also in Strasbourg this week about the importance of transatlantic ties. And in In fact, later we'll be crossing over to Sasha Vacalini, our correspondent who is in Davos, hearing how CEOs and investors feel how this second Trump presidency will go down for them. But you, as you say, Stefan Krobbe, anything can happen, anything is possible. But what do you think the mood is today over in Washington? And as I said earlier,
it depends on who you ask. It depends on who you ask and where people stand. I mean, Trump said, and I noticed this at the end of the speech, he said he wants to be peacemaker and a unifier. Well, I think his speech was far from a unifying exercise here, and America has never been so divided as it is now, and Trump is not doing anything so far to overcome this. And I'll leave it here.
Pictures there of Donald Trump and, of course, Melania Trump. I understand Melania Trump has been studying foreign affairs and foreign relations over the last couple of months, so she can have an important role as well in this new administration. But we're also curious to hear what people here in the Belgian capital think of this inauguration of Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States for the second time. So our reporter Noah Schumann was on the streets today of the capital finding out. He can take a listen.
Everything he promises, he delivers, whether it's good for some or bad for others. But he's a straightforward person, and I like him for that.
It's dangerous to have such a president of the United States, which is the most powerful person in this world. So it's quite frightening.
I'm not really happy about it. So about like immigration, about how it feels like about racism also.
Je suis pour l'élection de Trump.
I'm in favor of Trump's election, not because of the character he is, but because of his approach to the US economy. And I think we should follow his example.
On devrait prendre exemple.
I would rather say that I'm more worried than anything else in terms of what could be the implication of the new US foreign policy.
Tout va pas plaire.
Not everything is going to please, that's for sure. But no pain, no gain. If we talk about war, I think Trump is here to prevent us from having a war.
So there you go, some mixed opinions. One man there suggesting that everything Trump promises he delivers, and other one on foreign policy, one lady feeling that Trump will prevent another war. He did in his speech promise that he will be a peacemaker. The United States will not be entering any war under his watch. Is he trustworthy?
Well, I think that's almost a philosophical question. I think following what we said about the fact that he's very transactional, I think we will be, and especially I think from an EU perspective, we need to be very clear on what we will accept or not, because I think he is very transactional. He also makes very easy promises, because the war in Ukraine, initially he said that he would end that in 24 hours. Later he backtracked a little and said, well, I take 100 days. Peace in the Middle East, he also would need secure, and indeed we have been witnessing, of course, the recent development. But then I think, given he is so transactional by nature, I think we really, from an EU perspective, especially when it comes to Ukraine, need to be very keen on what we can accept or not, because, again, certain peace negotiations need to also preserve Ukraine's interest and not indeed just be about NATO spending and also giving Russia a big part of the deal. So as von der Leyen and also other EU leaders have been saying, Ukraine needs to agree to come to the table. And if that's not the case, then we can't accept any negotiation process. And again, there, I think predictability is not the word that comes to mind when I think about Trump and his role in these negotiations.
Well, just as I mentioned earlier, Donald Trump's inauguration is not the only major happening of the week as we speak. The World Economic Forum is underway in the snowy Swiss village of Davos. Everyone who is anyone in the world of business, politics and civil society is there this week discussing major global topics from the Middle East to Ukraine, climate change and artificial intelligence. But it's likely that Donald Trump's comeback is the talk of the town. For more, we can now cross over to Davos and bring in Euronews' correspondent Sasha Vacalini, who's standing by for us. Sasha, so lovely to have you with us here on the live show. I guess the first question, is Donald Trump's inauguration and his return to the White House dominating discussions in Davos? What are CEOs, investors and heads of state saying?
Certainly, that is the case here. I can even say that this day, which is officially the first day of the WEF annual meeting, is overshadowed by this inauguration. The official agenda has been a little bit pushed towards Tuesday because today is the inauguration day, and we have been around town here for the whole day, and we've seen, you enter some cafes or restaurants and you can see those TV screens, and everybody who is here in Davos was watching this inauguration. And that was the case, of course, as well for some of the houses, the so-called houses, the country representations on the promenade here in Davos, which was the case for Ukraine House, where we wanted to see how Ukrainians were watching the inauguration of Donald Trump.
And Sasha, what were Ukrainians saying to you there as you were there in the Ukrainian house and in Davos? What are they saying about this presidency of Donald Trump? Do they think that he'll be able to end the war like he's promised?
I would say that Ukrainians are more optimistic than the Europeans are. But then at the end of the day, I think it also has a lot to do with the fact that they have to be optimistic. We're almost 3 years into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And with the new president coming back to the White House, they want to believe that Donald Trump will help them not only end this war, but win this war. And he famously, of course, refused to answer what does he think how this end of the war should look like? Would that mean Ukraine's victory? He did not say that during the presidential debate. He refused to answer that question. But Ukrainians truly hope so, because at the end of the day, it's going to be about them accepting or not accepting some of these conditions regarding the peace deal and how is it happening. I would say that the atmosphere was quite positive at the Ukraine House, and certainly there was lots of attention. And you can see this big slogan on the facade of the Ukraine House here in Davos that says, "Your country first, win with us." Now, that message seems to be for one and only the President of the United States.
It does indeed. Sasha Vakilini, thank you so much for that live update from a very cold Davos. We'll be back to you a little bit later, but for now, let's bring in again Stefan Kobe from Euronews and, of course, Elizabeth Quipper from the European Policy Centre. So a lot at stake there, really. A lot of those Ukrainians hoping, perhaps nervously, cautiously optimistic to see what Donald Trump is actually able to achieve. We also heard earlier today from Vladimir Putin, from Russia's president, expressing how he feels about Donald Trump being back in the White House, saying he's open to rebuilding relations with the new US administration. So it sounds like Putin is open to dialogue here.
Yes, and I think we all know that Trump likes Putin. He likes authoritarian leaders, but he also likes to win and not be seen as a coward. So I'm not sure whether Trump is now kowtowing before Putin just because it's Putin. Remember that the war in Ukraine has become sort of internationalized by the participation of North Korean troops, by Chinese drones, etc., and now has and Iranian weapons. So Trump has is facing an entire wall of rogue actors on the global stage. Does he really want to lose against these guys? I'm not sure. And the fact that Trump has already backtracked dramatically. First, he said, as you mentioned, we end this war within a day, and then it was 100 days, and now it's 6 months. So one of the many promises he made during the campaign that he's now stepping back from. So I'm not sure. Again, I want to wait and see what happens. We also must not forget that in Congress there is still a majority in favor of support for Ukraine, and support for Ukraine is popular in the United States, and all surveys and polls suggest that. I don't think that cutting off aid entirely would help him on the domestic front, especially now that his majorities in Congress are very, very slim. We need to wait how things shake out, and of course how the situation develops on the ground militarily in Ukraine, and what happens next. And certainly what the Europeans are willing to do. Will they follow Trump when Trump says, I want to cut aid to Ukraine? Will they step in or
well, of course, the Europeans here, we also have a new administration, if you like. We have Kaja Kallas, the new foreign affairs chief, who said last week in Ramstein that the EU would be able to lead first on Ukraine if the new administration in the United States were not going to do so. Kaja Kallas, of course, from Estonia, very close to the situation, a lot of understanding of the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my opinion, she is right by saying that indeed the EU needs to deliver the budget because after all, already at the start of the Russian invasion 3 years ago, as your colleague just mentioned, Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, indeed mentioned that it was a Zeitenwende for the EU and indeed that the EU would be much more unconventional in its support, also its budgetary support to Ukraine. But after all those years, the EU has not been delivering as they should have. So I think there's a call for the EU as well, because with the risk that indeed the US is now either cutting down its budget or perhaps indeed stepping back altogether. That again is the element that we don't know yet because that remains to be seen. But I think that's that element as well. And I think perhaps from a more positive perspective, if you listened last week to Marco Rubio in his Senate hearing, I think he was much more indeed focusing on the importance of preserving support for Ukraine, but also at the same time, and I think that's back to my point, saying that indeed also the Europeans then need to step up their budgetary implications. Because he said we cannot, as the US, continue supporting other countries that don't have their domestic affairs in order, which I thought was quite an interesting quote.
And of course, President Trump has been calling for 5% of GDP to be spent by NATO members on defence.
Which would include the United States because the US defence budget is lower than 5% at the moment.
Indeed,
so
that was a very Trumpian quote.
That was a very Trumpian, yes.
And just I thought it was very interesting as well. I was reading analysis this week from the European Council of Foreign Relations, new data that they came up with that shows that people all across the world are very positive about this Donald Trump presidency, except in our region. So except around the European Union, the UK, Switzerland, Ukraine and Eastern Europe. But whereas over in India, in Saudi Arabia, in South Africa, people are very positive.
Don't ask me. I cannot explain this. I know why people are skeptical in the Western world, and that includes countries like South Korea and Japan. But apparently, and we're talking about big majorities, by the way. I've read the same.
Yeah, it's a really interesting report. It's by Timothy Garton-Ash, the British historian, and the Bulgarian expert Ivan Kratvets.
Yeah, I was reflecting on when I was reading it, and I think partly it's because of the fact that the EU as such, really since the Second World War, has been relying so much on the US when it comes to defense and security, but also in terms of economic security and innovation. Because I think it's for a reason that there's this saying that the US innovates and Europe regulates. And that always seemed to be the way things worked. And that's now changing. I think another big difference for me as well is that the first Trump administration was in a time when the challenges for the EU as such were different. Now there's also much more radical right parties within the EU, with the risk that indeed Trump too is going to divide and conquer. And that's perhaps also what makes people feeling unease if they're asked about potential implications for the EU. And that's perhaps a different risk than other parts of the world face.
Yeah, because at the moment it seems that President Trump doesn't have that much respect or time for the EU institutions and would rather go to the capitals if he wants to speak to Europe, which obviously is something that will very much upset Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Stefan.
Yeah, right. And I think some of his orbit, I'm not sure whether it was Trump himself, but somebody from his orbit suggested that the US could slap tariffs on Denmark for not being maladroit enough to discuss a potential sale of Greenland to the United States. That is, of course, typical Trumpian thinking. And I also remember Angela Merkel, while she was chancellor, when she was in Washington, had to remind Trump in a press conference that trade policy is the domain of the European Union, and that Germany is not able to negotiate trade conditions with the United States or any other EU country for that matter. So, but Trump is not thinking in terms of political reality in Europe. He has a huge disregard for global multilateral organizations and, of course, for EU institutions. And you mentioned, I think, at the beginning that he didn't invite any of the European leaders. Well, there you have it.
And he has plans as well to cut bureaucracy in DC, radically fight out corruption, and all these various plans as well to shave off a lot of the administration. It sounds a bit harder to do in reality, right? What he hopes to do.
Yeah, absolutely. That remains to be seen. And then it's also Elon Musk driving this exercise together with Ramaswamy, who also may be out already. But I think it touches on an important point, because indeed it's the sort of divide and conquer approach that we may see, that indeed Trump picks European leaders who he feels he can talk to. But I think, as we have seen during the ceremony just now, there was also a lot of representative from Silicon Valley, because we saw Musk, Zuckerberg and the likes. And it also means that there is much more private interest now prevailing over public interest. And I think there also the whole question about big tech and big regulation comes in place, where for the EU, in my opinion, it's very important that indeed the pieces of legislation and the instrument that the EU has will be reinforced. But you see, at least that was my reading, that the weeks leading to this inauguration, the EU was witnessing from the side how Trump would position himself. And I think also that now the months to come, it will be very important to see what is the EU going to do when it comes to content moderation, to Musk behavior by, for example, taking over TikTok, because we know that also one of the decisions that Trump indeed will make, I think now within 90 days, he has said this weekend, is about the future of TikTok. So I think when it comes to big tech regulations, there's also a really important part for the EU to witness.
Well, it's not clear what will be Trump's policy. I mean, what we can say today is Trump is the crypto president. He's the big tech president. He is the president of a right-tilting corporate America. And we've already seen over the past weeks how this could be the nucleus of a big domestic fight, of an intra-party fight between the diehard MAGA fans and like Steve Bannon, for instance, like the original MAGA characters, and Trump's new friends from Silicon Valley and from the tech and crypto industries. Whether these guys have the well-being of Trump's voters in Oklahoma, in Arkansas, in Alabama in mind when they try to push their agendas in the White House, that remains to be seen. And whether the Republican Congress will go along and support the tech billionaires, that is also another question. By the way, somebody has calculated that the number of billionaires in Trump's cabinet, their net worth together is about the equivalent of the GDP of countries like Finland and Chile. Wow. Now, Trump might be a popular president, but whether he is able to, or whether his government will be able to conduct a policy that is good for, the workers in the Rust Belt, et cetera, we'll see.
And of course, these billionaires pose a massive threat to Europe. You mentioned earlier Elon Musk and his also interference in European elections, in UK politics. He's been ruffling a lot of feathers. Members of the Parliament were also trying to court him and invite him to the European Parliament in Strasbourg for an actual face-to-face, tete-to-tete. But I don't think it has bared any fruit. But it will, of course, be a massive challenge in that realm in order to rein in people like Elon Musk. And also then domestically, how long will Elon Musk and Donald Trump even get on? They're both rather large personalities. That's also another question.
Yeah, and then I think, like Stefan said, it's really interesting in the months to come to see indeed how the different parts of the Republican Party indeed will be able to compromise on certain agreements, because indeed Trump has spoken about one big, beautiful legislative package that he's going to present, where he will include tax measures on the one hand, where indeed it's very cynical to realize that I think it's 13 billionaires in his broader cabinet will benefit from these measures, whereas like the man on the street that Trump always speaks about isn't going to benefit, of course, so much about these tax benefits. So tax benefits and migration policies. And there you see that there are very different opinions, because Musk and the like, from the Silicon Valley perspective, are actually quite in favor of high-skilled workers that also benefit from certain visas. And then you see that the diehard, the MAGA Republicans are actually quite skeptical about this, because they are much more in favor of a right-wing migration policy. So will Trump be able to reconcile these different wings of the party and come up with a compromise? Question mark.
A lot of question mark. We'll have a lot of reporting to do here on Euronews as well, as we see what the impacts of this new administration have on the European Union. At the European Policy Centre there, you've put together a rather long dossier, Elizabeth Quipper, with your colleagues on the challenges for the European Union. And also Donald Trump has vouched to sign no less than 200 executive orders on his first couple of days in office. Do you think he'll go ahead and do that?
I have no reason to doubt this. I mean, he telegraphed this weeks ago, I think, and on the during the pre-inauguration party in Washington. He mentioned it again. He was cover all fields of his, all his pet projects, from migration to, fighting the deep state and pardoning J6 convicts, etc., etc. So, I think the thing with executive orders is that you can easily undo them. If an initiative, a legislative initiative, doesn't go through the congressional protocol or process, rather, then it's very difficult to keep executive orders going. Biden undid a lot of executive orders that Trump issued. Trump is going the same thing with Biden's executive orders. That is not political strategy. That is not long term, and it's certainly not enduring. So what
it does
remains?
Take up a lot of airtime, doesn't it? All that.
Yeah, right. But it's good. It's good for television. I mean, he signs it, he holds it into the cameras, and then people think, "Oh my God, he changed." Why was
it's good for television, but it's not
America's
good for
political class
really
unable to do anything until this guy came along, right?
Well, one thing's clear: he does have executive authority. But let's just go back to the impact this will all have on Europe and on the European Union and various policies. I know in your paper as well, you've looked at issues like climate change, which, of course, Donald Trump has not really got in his radar. That's something that he wants to work on.
Absolutely, because indeed, together with my colleagues at the European Policy Center, I've been putting together a compendium with indeed the potential consequences of the second Trump administration. And indeed, we're looking at external challenges from economic security, but also to climate change and health policy, to indeed internal challenges to do with the state of democracy, but also the role of big tech, as we already said. And I think climate is an interesting one because on the one hand, we have all heard Trump saying, drill, baby, drill, and I'm going to go back on the Paris Agreement, something that he also indeed said that he would do on day one as well. And again, on the one hand, these are very important signals, and they would be very detrimental signals for climate policy because it would send the wrong signal to other parts of the world that need to step up their climate intentions rather than step down. I think at the same time, and I think then we're back to what political support he gets for these measures, because you actually see that Biden, with his big legislative packets called the Inflation Reduction Act, that was also a lot about environmental measures, got a lot of support also from Republican governors at state level. So there the question is Trump really going to make himself popular if he completely gets backtracking with his climate intentions? Because the US is one of the clean tech leaders in the world. There's clearly an economic security and also competitive advantage to it. If you see that also China is really stepping up its ambitions in the green area, also with electric vehicles, is it really wise also from a business perspective to completely backtrack? So there also is a lot of question marks also about the political support indeed that Trump eventually would need for these measures.
It certainly will be a stress test under the next couple of years. But just going back to, you mentioned electric cars, there was a chunk of his speech related to cars, of course, striking a chord with his voters. He was saying you'll be able to choose the car that you like. Can you elaborate more on his speech in that area?
Yeah, well, he said he would end the Green Deal and the electric vehicle mandate, which is bizarre as, right behind him was Elon Musk, who makes a lot of money out of electric vehicles. Well, it's not only, and then he said people will have the choice, whatever car they like, so there shouldn't be any political pushes towards the stronger sales of electric vehicles. The trouble is that electric vehicles, and I take one product now, is an innovative product for the future, and fossil fuel cars are not. And that is the problem. If Trump wants to stymie innovation and progress in this field. It's hard for me to see how this matches with all the MAGA ambitions that he has. And on the drill baby drill thing, America is already producing record levels of oil and gas right now under Biden. They are flooding saturated markets. The Biden administration was willing to give out licenses in Alaska for drilling operations, and no company wanted to buy any of these licenses because they were not interested, because they have enough oil and gas on the market. So if Trump wants more oil and gas on the market, prices will go down with the effect that is then rippling through the economy. So again, it's a nice sounding promise and a nice sounding, certainly red meat to his base. But does it make economic sense? A lot of people question that.
At the same time, when Trump indeed already months or before his election was indeed trying to relate to the EU by saying, well, I'm going to slam tariffs on the EU as well, because again, their export is much too high. Then Ursula von der Leyen already said, well, in that case, perhaps indeed we would need to buy a bit more liquid natural gas, LNG from the US. So there you already saw another trade-off coming in, which is another interesting one to watch.
It is indeed. There's a lot to watch in every sector of our lives. And of course, we'll see how we'll be impacted here in Europe. But as I said earlier, Trump's inauguration as 47th President of the United States is not the only big news story taking place this week. The global elites are also gathering this week for the World Economic Forum in the snowy skiing village of Davos. And our Euronews correspondent, Sasha Vacalini, is there for us all week on the ground reporting, and we can cross again to her live. Good to see you there, Sasha. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you just tell us what a Donald Trump presidency, a second presidency, could mean for Ukraine, and what happened to his "I will finish the war in 24 hours" promise? What are people saying there in Davos?
That was arguably one of his most famous promises, wasn't it, when he said that he was going to finish it in 24 hours. Now, lots of people here in Davos I talked to, also lots of representatives of the Ukrainian delegation, are saying that actually the shift and what he says now about possibly 3 months or 6 months, this is something that could be good news for Ukraine. And this is why finishing it and putting an end to it somehow in 24 hours would certainly mean having leverage over Ukraine when it comes to all the US support and the US aid, while taking more time, about 3 to 6 months, means actually that Donald Trump and the new administration might take this time trying to look for leverage over Russia to see how those conditions will play there. So this is indeed being seen as actually good news or better news for Ukraine.
And of course, Donald Trump's swearing-in ceremony is taking place today. Otherwise, he probably would have been in Davos among business leaders and CEOs. Is he almost like the elephant in the room there? Is everyone talking about Donald Trump in Davos this week?
Well, certainly that is indeed the case. We're expecting here on Tuesday to hear from Volodymyr Zelensky himself, the president of Ukraine, wondering whether he's going to mention that. He did congratulate Donald Trump on X, saying that President Trump is always decisive and the peace through strength policy he announced provides an opportunity to strengthen American leadership and achieve long-term just peace, which is the top priority. It's again that phrase about the peace through strength policy. Now, when it comes to Trump and the Davos crowd, you might say he is expected to address all the participants here live by video link, and they're promising an interactive discussion with the participants at the World Economic Forum this year and Donald Trump.
OK, we'll certainly tune in for that. Sasha Vacalini, thank you so much for joining us there live from Davos, from the World Economic Forum. And if you've just tuned into us here on Euronews, I'm Maeve McMahon, and I'm in the studio here joined by Euronews' Stefan Kobe and also Elizabeth Quipper, analyst and associate director for the European Policy Centre, a think tank based here in Brussels. And we're just taking a look at the swearing-in ceremony and the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States, of Donald Trump. Earlier today, he was sworn in at noon local time in a solemn ceremony. The Bidens said goodbye and the Trumps arrived. Then they were off to a lunch. And as they are dining, we are analysing what this Trump presidency could mean for Europe, for the climate, for foreign affairs, for ending the war in Ukraine, and for of course tech policy. So we can bring in now Stefan Krobbe and Elizabeth Quipper here in the studio. They're having lunch, right? So talk us through the lunch. Is there more pomp than what we saw in the ceremony earlier?
Well, normally there is the big parade.
Which was cancelled today, right?
Which was basically moved in, or parts of the parade will now be inside the Washington sports arena. Yes, all this because of the cold in Washington D.C. It is an American presidential inauguration. It's a popular celebration of American democracy, and we haven't really seen that today and yesterday. I think we've seen a very partisan event. The people of Washington, the citizens of Washington, basically absent from this event, and it's of course the Trump diehard supporters, MAGA supporters, coming into town and celebrating Donald Trump. And his speech was, I found it rather underwhelming, and also not the. I think there was no element that really surprised me. It was a rehash of platitudes, of campaign statements that culminated in his phrase that he wants to be a unifier. I don't really see that happening after the speech. I also must say, if I were a diehard Trump supporter, I wouldn't really be fired up. All these things we've heard before, and word by word.
Yeah, it was very similar to his election
speech.
His golden era. And America.
I mean, we should not forget one thing. If Donald Trump had won 2 consecutive terms as president, he would be a lame duck starting now. But he's only the second president in American history who won 2 non-consecutive terms. The first one was Grover Cleveland at the end of the 19th century, who after his second term was tired of politics, and the country was tired of him. But he had the luxury of thinking of a potential third run for president and a third term for president. Trump does not have that luxury. In 4 years, he'll be out of office. In 2 years, there will be congressional elections, midterm elections, that usually have the opposition party gain seats. And gaining seats right now means that the majority, at least in the House of Representatives, will shift to the Democrats. All of a sudden, Trump doesn't have the majorities anymore that he needs to implement all his ambitious projects, from getting back the Panama Canal that he talked about today to
and his
tariffs,
expansion to Mars. He even mentioned expansion.
This was
to
the
Mars.
was the most.
The biggest surprise,
outrageous.
basically.
Really, I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether he takes himself serious when he mentions that.
It must be Elon Musk's whispering in his ear for that.
I mean, I agree with you, Stefan. At the same time, I think we also know that he has the support of the Supreme Court, which is also a sort of much longer lasting legacy that goes beyond the 4 years that he's in power. And I think what's also an important element to mention is that he's probably much more accepted than the first time around. So his anti-establishment, much more polarizing populist narrative is now accepted. Whereas I still remember from 2016, people didn't even believe that Trump would win the first time around. And I think now he's much more mainstream, and especially from a European perspective, from a pro-European perspective, the pro-Europeans are now probably more marginal than they were indeed 8 years ago. And the anti-establishment, more Eurosceptic narrative is much more mainstream. And I think that is a big shift. And there I can see also a much longer lasting legacy that Trump potentially has.
Well, he did win the popular vote, and he is indeed now, on Inauguration Day, a very popular man, and got cheered for all of his statements today in that speech where he said he would also crack down on cartels, designate them as foreign terrorist organisations. He also said there are only two genders, male and female. Statements as well that received big cheers in the crowd, which statements like that, if you said them in our neck of the woods here, would be frowned upon.
Yeah, I mean, what do you say to this? If somebody says there are two genders, male and female, yes, of course. What is the problem? The problem is that in the United States, the gender affirming care, and that's the problem, and teenagers who have been a boy suddenly are girls, and then competing with other girls in girls' sports. But this is a tiny fraction of the population, less than 1%, way less than 1% of the population that is actually affected by this. But Trump and his campaign has made this a huge issue in the culture war that is raging in America for many, many years now. But it has, for the all-day life of people who don't know how to pay their bills at the end of the month, has no meaning at all. But he throws these things out.
And then you have people like Mark Zuckerberg who joined in and are participating in these culture wars with his statements as well on that podcast. Joe Rogan podcast.
Exactly, because indeed I was listening to the Joe Rogan Zuckerberg podcast, which is not per se an enlightening experience, but I think it explains very well the thinking behind. So there's a lot of we against them. So there's that very sort of toxic narrative as well. And I think also more practically, you have to realize that in the EU, think about the Hungarian government, there are already people that wholeheartedly support these policies that are against gender policies. Another measure that Trump probably will propose on his first day is indeed also to do with global health. I mean, he will probably announce that he's going to leave the World Health Organization, but also there is a policy which says actively, and I think it's since Reagan that policy always has been proposed by Republican presidents, that indeed NGOs that, and this is about international NGOs, that support abortion policies, that they will get their funding stopped. And again, so that's a very practical consequence potentially of indeed these quotes that he indeed uses all the time.
But isn't that interesting? He didn't mention abortion in his inaugural address at all. And it was such an important issue during the campaign. But Trump knows that this is not a winning issue for Republicans, and he himself was very vague in terms of what he would do on a federal level. And it's quite striking to me that such a huge issue he didn't address in his inaugural address. But this is one of the big differences between us in Europe and Americans, the culture war that we don't really have. Although sometimes now with the emergence of the far right, you think here and there, it's popping up.
And we haven't spoken much about his administration, the fact that there's an anti-vaxxer, Robert Kennedy Jr., he'll be the health secretary and COVID-19 lockdown skeptic. If confirmed, of course, he'll be the head of the National Institute of Health. So it'll be a very
absolutely. I mean, already, and that's also what I wrote in this piece, indeed, the incoming administration has already been described as the most anti-public health administration in history, if indeed RFK Jr. gets confirmed. And we know indeed everything that RFK Jr. has been saying. So indeed on gender policies, but also about health, the fact that during COVID, of course, we heard the biggest nonsense when it came to addressing COVID. And again, it remains to be seen if that gets and becomes a mainstream narrative, but it's frightening enough in itself. And it will have a lot of implications for global health as well.
And here you have written about the challenges. What about the good news stories, or what about the positive side of a Trump presidency for the European Union? Is there anything positive that can be reaped as well?
Well, I think it's not an easy one if you think about the potential implications, but I think what may be positive is indeed that the EU is now really urged to become more united. Because again, due to the external pressure, which again, the EU has always had difficulties with, in the sense that the EU has always been growing through crisis. And as one of the founding fathers, Jean Monnet, has always said, it always became stronger after crisis. So perhaps indeed one consequence could be, and I hope it's going to be the case, that indeed the EU gets more united, becomes also more aware of the fact that big reforms are needed, so that the EU, in terms of economic security, in terms of defense and security, becomes more convinced on its own role and not always reliant on bigger partners like the US.
And Stefan, meanwhile...
I agree. If there were any positive impulses coming out of the coming from the Trump administration for us Europeans, I think it is the necessity to step up our defense efforts. This is very clear. We have been living for too long with the head in our heads in the sand and not looking around us. That worked as long as the Americans were on our side, and U.S. governments, Republican and Democratic administrations, considered Europe the closest American allies. Trump doesn't do that anymore. He's not into allies at all. And so what can we gain from a more inward-looking America? And I think at least the idea that we need to step up our defense efforts. That's and making sure that the global order keeps working at least for the next 4 years.
Yeah, and I think also coming up with bold approaches, because indeed the multilateral order as we know it may not work anymore. The transatlantic relationship as we knew it is perhaps not working anymore, but I think indeed it also allows the EU to come up with bold proposals, and I think that's an important one, really.
Well, as you say, the transatlantic relationship is not working anymore, as in the phone lines are not functioning anymore between the Berlaymont and the White House. As in the other day, we were in a press briefing, and the Commission spokes told the press that we have reached out to the Trump administration and we haven't heard back. So it seems that they're being ghosted.
Yeah, they don't know who to call, who to contact, but nobody knows, right?
This is a huge problem for diplomacy,
figure out
protocol.
Who at the White House is in charge of transatlantic relations, who at the State Department. So this is an incoming administration. It's always a big moment in American politics to see who gets what job, etc. And then, after the dust has settled, the next few weeks or so, we hopefully will be able to identify the people who would be willing to take our call.
As you say, when the dust settles. Stefan, what do you think will be the legacy of State Secretary Antony Blinken and, of course, of the Bidens as well?
Well, I think if you ask them, they would say that they have restored trust in America, trust in American policies around the world, trust in the multilateral system. Which was no small order, given Trump's first term. Biden ended the war in Afghanistan that Trump had engineered. We all know how it ended. Nobody wanted that, but at least Biden put an end to this. I think he strengthened the multilateral institutions and processes, and he was somebody who was pretty much admired here in this town in Brussels. He had a very good relationship with Ursula von der Leyen.
He was perhaps admired more in this town than back home, right, in the United States.
Correct.
The Democrats, Elizabeth Whipper, now clearly licking their wounds as they prepare then for the midterms in 2 years and then fresh elections in a couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely, because I think indeed what Biden is now remembered for is his age and the fact, I think, that he stepped down too late in the campaign so that Kamala Harris didn't really have a choice. I think also indeed the war in the Middle East, I think, reflects badly on his legacy. But perhaps longer term, people will also see that indeed his investment in innovation and climate change, with indeed the Inflation Reduction Act, but also the CHIPS Act, was actually quite strategic. So I think perhaps longer term, if people reflect on his legacy, these will also be elements that will be remembered.
And meanwhile, earlier in President Trump's speech, he said the golden age of America begins right now. Stefan, he said from this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected all across the world. We will be the envy of every nation, and we will not allow ourselves to be taken advantage of any longer. I mean, he didn't mention Europe, but that was obviously a little dig to us here in the European Union?
Yeah, I mean, Trump is painting a very negative picture of America, and it simply needs to be rectified. I mean, this impression. The economy is very, very strong in the United States. The flow of immigrants is down. The lowest numbers in years and years and years. Inflation is trending down. The economy is humming, which I mentioned. So there is no point saying, as Trump did in one of his first sentences today, that America's decline will end now. It's interesting when he always says, MAGA, make America great again. I wonder, what does he mean by again? Is it, back in the 1950s when Eisenhower was president, or is it back, when was America greater than today? It's interesting that Trump mentioned one of his predecessors, William McKinley, the president who sponsored a very strong policy of tariffs. Obviously, Trump loves McKinley because of this. But it was also, and Trump said in those days, at the end of the 19th century, America was great, America was strong, there was nobody comparable in the world. But it was also the time of the robber barons. It was time when corruption, political corruption, was flourishing in the United States. And when policies were dictated by oligarchs. And if I look at Trump's orbit today, Elon Musk, et cetera, there are some striking similarities here. So does he really mean we need to go back to the end of the 19th century here? Why was America stronger then? Today, I have trouble understanding this, but it's still nobody could ever explain to me for the last 8 years what does that actually mean, make America strong
Well, one thing
again.
from a marketing perspective, it is pretty slick communications, MAGA, isn't it? And it looks great on
Oh,
it.
absolutely.
But Stefan Krobe from Euronews and Elizabeth Quipper from the European Policy Centre, we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your live analysis here on Euronews, and thank you so much for watching. You've been with us here for the last hour for our live show all about the inauguration of the 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump. For more in-depth analysis and news on today's inauguration and swearing-in ceremony, you can check out our live blog on euronews.com. But for now, thank you so much again for watching. Take care and see you soon on Euronews.
President Joe Biden used the last hours of his presidency to issue preemptive pardons for Dr. Anthony Fauci, retired General Mark Milley, and members of the House committee that investigated the January 6 attack on the Capitol. The decision is aimed at protecting those who have been targeted by Donald Trump in the past from potential revenge by the Trump administration. Trump has warned of a so-called enemies list featuring those who have targeted him politically. Biden used the power in the broadest and